Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Lori Peek, the Director of Veterinary Programs for Maddie's Fund. We've taken on a big topic tonight, understanding cats. At Maddie's Institute, we're really committed to helping you find innovative, humane, and effective ways to keep cats healthy, reduce stress, and send them to a loving home or habitat. Helping us with that effort is Dr. Susan Krebsbach, a veterinary consultant for Maddie's Institute and the Humane Society Veterinary Medical Association, as well as founder of Dane County Friends of Ferals. She's going to be presenting tonight's webcast, Your Secret Decoder Ring, Feline Behavior Assessments. But before we get started, there's just a few practical things we need to cover. First, those of you here tonight, you'll be entered into a drawing for one of 10 personally signed copies of the book, The Cat Who Cried for Help, Attitudes, Emotions, and the Psychology of Cats by Dr. Nicholas Dodman, a veterinarian who is board certified in animal behavior and a director of Animal Behavior Clinic at Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine. Next, please take a look at the lower left-hand side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where you'll be asking questions during the presentation. Dr. Krebsbach will be answering as many of the questions as she can at the end of the presentation, but please don't hold your questions until then. Ask them all during the event. Questions asked at the last few minutes will probably not be processed in time for a response, so get yours in as soon as you can. If you need any help with your connection during the presentation, you can click the question mark or help icon at the bottom of your screen, or go to event.on24.com/view/help. You'll also see other little images at the bottom along with the help button. These are widgets that will take you to the plethora of resources our presenter wanted to share with you tonight, as well as some shared by Maddie's Institute. You may notice we have 2 resource widgets. Please be sure and check them out. Before I turn things over to Dr. Krebsbach, I want to say a few words about Maddie's Fund. We are the nation's leading funder of shelter medicine education, and it's our goal to help save the lives of all our nation's healthy and treatable shelter dogs and cats. The inspiration for that goal was a little dog named Maddie, who shared her unconditional love with Dave and Cheryl Duffield. They promised her they would honor that love by founding Maddie's Fund and helping make this country a safe and loving place for all her kind. Please use what you learn here tonight to make the dream she inspired a reality. Dr. Krebsbach, thank you for being here with us this evening.
Great. Thank you for that great introduction, Dr. Peek. I really appreciate it. Animal behavior is a real passion of mine and something that I've been involved with for over a decade now. Of particular interest to me is feline behavior in a shelter setting, so I'm just delighted to be presenting on this topic of feline behavior assessments. Well, tonight we're going to be covering several topics here. Here we go to the next one. And we'll be looking at kind of a cursory overlook of the components of a shelter behavior program, talking about some of the differences between cats and dogs, defining a definition of behavior assessments, their use, their goals, what are some of the challenges that we face, and what are some of the available feline behavior assessment tools that we currently have available to us. And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of performing behavior assessments and then end with some conclusions. But before we get started on these agenda items, I wanted to make everyone aware that I understand that what we will be discussing tonight is the ideal, but not many shelters. But many shelters do not have the resources at this point in time to implement all the steps that will be reviewed. But you are taking an important first step, which is becoming educated about feline behavior assessments, and I commend you for doing that. Okay. So let's talk about some of the components of a shelter program. And from my standpoint, I believe there's 6 different areas that we should be looking at. The first is surrender prevention. Behavior problems are the most common cause of euthanasia in pet cats, and one of the most common reasons that animals are surrendered to animal shelters and rescue organizations. This is why surrender prevention should be an integral part of a shelter behavior program. The next is behavior assessments, which we'll be discussing in detail during tonight's webcast. And the third is welfare in the shelter, which includes such things as environmental enrichment, housing, stress reduction, and really most importantly, adoption ASAP. There is a reference that is in the resource widgets. That's the Association of Shelter Veterinarians Guidelines for Standards of Care in Animal Shelters. If you have not taken a look at this, I'd really encourage you to do that. It's a really good source of information. And then the next one is bringing out the best. And this involves maximizing adaptability, including such things as the need for a behavior modification program, a foster care program, play interactions, things along that line. As a matter of fact, Dr. Sheila D'Arpino is going to be presenting at the Animal Care Expo this month on a topic entitled Providing Behavioral Care for Treatable Dogs and Cats. It's easier and cheaper than you think. And we will have that available on the Maddie's Institute website if it's something that if you don't get an opportunity to go to Expo this year, but that information will be there. We're going to be actually filming the entire presentation. The next component is adoption. And this involves such things as matching the adopter with the pet and providing care information. And lastly is post-adoption support. And what we want to do is we want to be a resource to adopters after they've made the commitment. Excuse me. This may involve providing help with behavior problems or making the adopter aware of resources that are available to them. As a matter of fact, some shelters even provide follow-up behavior consultations if needed at no additional charge to the adopter. Now, all of the components are important, but this webcast is going to concentrate on just one, behavior assessments. And any shelter behavior program should be reevaluated periodically based on current information. Okay. So the next one. Let's talk a little bit about dogs and cats. Although the definition, use, and goals of behavior assessments are the same for dogs and cats, executing them are different between the species. Numerous studies regarding behavior assessments for dogs have been conducted and have been used to predict problem behaviors in dogs following adoption. This practice is not routinely used for cats, leading to placement of cats on superficial characteristics such as color, while cats' behavior is a frequently cited reason for relinquishment of cats to shelters. We all know that the behavior of dogs and cats is different. Just consider some of these quotes, and I think that you'll understand what I mean. Dogs have owners. Cats have staff. Dogs believe every stranger is a friend they haven't met yet. Cats wait for a proper invitation. And dogs come when they're called. Cats take a message and will get back to you. So I think you guys all understand what I'm talking about as far as the differences. Now, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about some characteristic differences between dogs and cats. And the three most important ones from my standpoint, from a behavior standpoint, would be the social structure, communication, and attachment. With cats, we define their social structure as independence with social relationships. With dogs, it's deference within a pack. So over the past few years, our knowledge of cat social structure has slowly evolved away from a widespread belief that cats are exclusively a very asocial species. There's a wide diversity in sociability and social structure in groups of cats. But cats don't work cooperatively together. They are solitary hunters and hunt prey that's smaller than they are. Cats' social behavior does not evolve around social hierarchies like it does with dogs. Although most cats will adapt well to sharing their home with people and other pets, it's not unusual for some cats to have difficulty adjusting to changes in the household, particularly the introduction of a new cat. Where dogs, with living in the group or their pack, there's a dominant leader holding the top position and subordinates holding lower ranking positions in a fairly linear hierarchy. Dogs have this hierarchy in order to maintain a good group cohesion. So in the wild, the group hunting enables them to hunt prey, which is much larger than them. So let's talk a little bit about communication. Cats combine facial expressions, body postures, smell, and vocalization to express their needs and responses. Although dogs are capable of vocalization, most of their social communication is accomplished by means of facial expressions, body postures, and occasionally body contact. And then lastly, attachment. The cats is really for the territory, the dogs with the pack, with their pack. And if they're living in the home with us, that makes us, the humans, their people, the leader. But why does this difference exist? Cats are not generally gregarious and do not develop strong pack structures where leadership is an important function. Cats in the wild are mostly solitary creatures, hunting alone. While they live in formed groups like we talked about, this is more of a sharing of a common territory than the establishment of a cohesive pack. Cats are extremely territorial, and when fights over territory occur, the result is the loser learns to avoid the successor, but not leave the territory. Leaving the territory only occurs if aggression encounters continue. So a cat's attachment is to his or her territory, not to the group. Now, although this may seem fairly obvious, I think it's worth stating. Because of the differences between dogs and cats, behavior assessments for dogs cannot be applied to cats. What it does tell us is that because we are doing behavior assessments for dogs, we should be doing it with cats as well. All right. I think we're going to go to our first poll question.
Yep, we have our first poll question. And the question is, does your shelter do formal behavior assessments for both dogs and cats, dogs only, cats only, and we do not do formal behavior assessments for cats and dogs, cats or dogs. So does your shelter do formal behavior assessments for these items? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and push the results. So 21% said both dogs and cats, 40% said dogs only, 7% said cats only, and 31% said we do not do formal behavior assessments for cats or dogs.
Yeah, that is great. I'm not surprised by those numbers, Dr. Peak. It's very typical that more shelters do assessments of dogs because we know so much more about that. But what's encouraging is that we're seeing more and more shelters doing assessments for dogs and cats. So that's encouraging. All right. Well, let's go on. Thanks for answering that question, by the way, everyone. Let's talk about a definition of behavior assessments. Now, there's a variety of definitions in the literature, but the one listed here is what I find to be the most useful. And one of the key points in this definition is at a point in time. Feline behavior assessments are looking at the cat's behavior at one point in time, which is influenced by location, time at the shelter, individual evaluator, things along that line. But there's some other definitions I want to review with you too. Temperament, character, personality are terms often used interchangeably in studies of animals to describe the sum total of behavioral attributes which characterize an individual and set him or her apart from others. So the first one we'll talk about here is temperament. And really it's the emotional responses. It's the pet's natural or innate responses to his or her environment. It's considered stable over time. It's the foundation of the personality. And the character can influence it but not change it. Now we'll talk about character. And it's considered the product of the animal's environment and experience. Behaviors seen are the animal's habits of responding to stimuli. These develop secondary to experiences, so it's really a learning history. And it's influenced by the changing environment. And then lastly is personality. It's a combination of temperament and character. It's an animal's overall way of responding to the environment. It's based on past experience and genetic tendencies. And it's the characteristics that make us unique or an individual. Now, you often hear the term temperament testing used to describe behavior assessments. I disagree with this terminology for two reasons. First of all, temperament only looks at one feature that makes up one's personality. With behavior assessments, we're looking for attributes that characterize the individual pet, which may be different in different circumstances. Secondly, testing implies pass-fail. This is really not how it should be used. It's virtually impossible for a shelter to assess overall temperament, character, or personality via a one-time evaluation. We are just assessing behavior at one point in time. All right, so how do we use behavior assessments? It's really, behavior assessments are an ancillary tool that is to be added to information gathered from other resources, including things like the owner relinquishment questionnaire and staff and volunteer experiences and their observation. Now, the resources widget that Dr. Peek mentioned earlier has several examples of relinquishment or surrender questionnaire forms. What we're looking for here is to be an objective, safe, aware of individual animal needs to achieve the overall goal of increasing adoptions and saving lives. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not a pass-fail test of adoptability. And that leads us to, we're going to be doing some ongoing mini assessments or behavioral rounds. And these are done as part of an ongoing process with the cat, while the cat is a resident at the shelter. But it is important to remember that the shelter is an artificial situation which can influence their behavior. But we do the best that we can. All right, what are the goals? Now, I feel there are essentially 3 goals of behavior assessments. That includes, identifying the needs of the individual cat, input for shelter pathway planning, and our ultimate goal is matching the pet with the very best possible home that we can. And we'll be discussing each one of these goals in more detail. So the first one, looking at the individual cat. What we're doing here is we're gathering some baseline information. And it starts with the first surrender contact. With the caregiver. We want to encourage the caregiver to take advantage of available resources to keep the cat and review these available resources with them. Now, this is going to require some staff training. It's important that we not be judgmental, that we really facilitate a team approach with the caregiver, and we assume the best, because when we do that, we're more likely to get the best. Also, if possible, we want to keep track of the conversation and information on the pet's record. But remember that the reasons for surrendering the cat is not always reflective of what is actually going on in the cat, meaning if the cat has any problems. And it's similar to a physical exam, but for behavior. So what we're doing is the surrender and behavior history first, if applicable, then physical exam, then behavior assessment, then a plan set up for that cat. And we need to identify what needs to be, what we need to do to bring out the best in the cat. Does the cat need to go into a behavior modification program or into foster care? And it's really the start of providing for the cat's welfare during his or her stay, at the shelter for successful adoption. Okay, I think we've got our next poll question.
Yep, we've got our next poll question. So, how does your shelter keep records on people wanting to surrender their cats? This information is not kept by the shelter. A log is kept, but specific information is not included. The information is described on a written form. The information is inputted into a computer database or other. So how does your shelter keep records on people wanting to surrender their cats? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and push these results. So it looks like 12% said this information is not kept by the shelter. 5% said a log is kept but specific information is not included. 45% said the information is described on a written form. 26% said the information is input into a computer database. And 12% said other.
Wow, that's great. I have to say I'm surprised to see this, that the shelters are keeping track of this information, that 45% are actually writing it down in written form, and a whopping 22% are actually putting in their computer databases. So that's wonderful, because that's that information we definitely need if the cat were eventually surrendered. Okay. So let's go on talking more about the goals of behavior assessment and essentially, pathway planning. Pathway planning is a method of actively tracking each animal's shelter stay from the moment they arrive to the moment that they leave. And the reason this is done is to reduce the length of stay. We want to keep them on the conveyor belt to adoption as quickly as possible. So now for the decision making for the shelter population, the individual animal's needs determines the path which leads to decision making for the shelter. So we want to tailor the service to who is in the greatest need by moving, for example, highly adoptable cats quickly through the system. They stay healthier so that you have the time to focus on the less healthy, whether it be from a behavior standpoint or from a medical standpoint. And it helps us answer the question, does the shelter have the resources to adopt out this cat? Is he or she an immediate adoption candidate? Is there a need for special housing, foster care, a behavior modification program? Would this cat be better suited by being transferred to another rescue organization, or maybe a barn cat program? If there's, you could also decline intake of cats once your capacity is reached. By saying yes to everything and being overtaxed, it's really, we're doing a disservice. So it's okay to say no. And by doing so, you are doing a service to the shelter and the cat if you cannot do a good job for him or her. Now, the other neat thing about this is important in identifying life-saving alternatives. If there's a need for additional external resources, reaching out to the community. So examples of external resources would be, for example, if you had a cat that was urinating outside the litter box, transferring that cat to a rescue group with either flexible housing or foster care. If you're exceeding capacity, starting a feral free room program to reduce the intake of cats. As a matter of fact, Dr. Julie Levy did a webcast back in January regarding, it was entitled Shelter Crowd Control, Keeping Community Cats Out of Shelters, and she talks about the Feral Freedom Program. So if you hadn't had a chance to watch that webcast, I'd encourage you to do that. She did a fantastic job. Another example would be if you have free-roaming cats. You can do something with a colleague of mine called TNR Star. And so what that might mean is trap, neuter, return, returning the cat to the original location, trap, neuter, relocate, relocating to perhaps a feral colony, or trap, neuter, rehome. If they're a friendly cat, rehoming them to a household. So there's lots of different options out there, but it's working with the community and working with other shelters to try to obtain that. I'm getting, as Dr. Peak pointed out before, I'm real involved with a local organization here in the Madison, Wisconsin area called Dane County Friends of Ferals. And this is just an example of our pathway planning that we're going to be using for behavior assessments. And so it starts out with the behavior assessment. And what we decide, okay, is the cat feral or friendly? And if we don't know for sure, is this a cat that would benefit from a behavior modification plan? What we're looking for is that we want to be able to identify, should this cat go to a rural home, be adopted to a rural home with a responsible caregiver, or being adopted to an indoor home. Now you'll notice that there's also, we've got dotted lines that go in between the circles in the middle. So from the behavior modification program, they may turn out, okay, we feel that they're friendly, so then they go to an indoor home. But they're feral, they would go to an outdoor home. And sometimes they can go in between those two categorizations while they're at the shelter. But it's a really helpful tool in moving the cat along that conveyor belt to adoption. And that's kind of the way I want you to think about it. And of course, our ultimate goal is to match the pet with the very best possible home. And so by doing this, we attempt to match the potential caregiver's lifestyle and expectations with the most suitable cat personality. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. So there are several challenges that we have with using behavior assessments, and you can see that they're listed there. I'm going to take some time talking about each one specifically. So the first is a need for standardization. Now, in order to have a good assessment, the behavior assessment should be standardized, with the only variable being the animal being assessed, which of course is difficult to do. But by having the assessment performed, recorded, and reported in the same manner, this can really help reduce the evaluation variability. And so that's why having formal assessments that evaluators have to follow is really helpful to set us up for a better standardization. The next is improving reliability. The definition of reliability is the extent to which an experiment, test, or measuring procedure yields the same results on repeated trials. So one way we can do this is through training. Now, training is important because it can provide a level playing field for those who are involved with behavior assessments. For example, one person's definition of fear may be very different from someone else's. So what you might want to consider doing is compiling a behavior assessment handbook. An organization can develop consistent evaluation procedures, definitions, and criteria for outcome decisions. So we can, again, help with that reliability. Also, training of personnel involved with assessments to recognize cat body language will also improve reliability. Some additional ways we can improve reliability would be have periodic evaluator reviews. So people who perform the behavioral evaluations should receive periodic reviews to assess intra and inter evaluator reliability. This can be done by videotaping assessments and then meeting to discuss modification of techniques and provide further education. Another way is that evaluators work in teams. By doing this, we can informally create what's called an index of concordance. And statistically speaking, it's a way of, for assessing agreement among raters, giving the portion of times that the observers agreed. It's also a way to prevent missing subtle body language signals when you're standing above the cat. And a second person can help in the evaluation process as well as keep you safe. Another way is to perform the assessments in a designated room. Just use that same room over and over again and don't even have that be a variable in your assessment. And then lastly, remove yourself if biased. Don't test cats that you're biased about. For example, if you have a special place in your heart for all orange tabbies that prevents you from being objective, it might be best for you not to be the one that does the assessment. And then we have validation of results. The definition of validation is an act or process that supports or collaborates a finding on a sound or authoritative basis. Now, although there are varying types of validity with any test, the main question to be asked is, are we really measuring what we think we're measuring? So are we identifying the needs of the individual cat, providing input for pathway planning, matching the cat to the best possible home, predicting behavior in the new home, protecting the public from harm? So we've got lots of different things that we're considering here. And there hasn't been a lot of work done in this area, but there is one study that's been quoted quite commonly, and that was done in 2003 by Janice Sigford and colleagues, and it's entitled Validation of a Temperament Test for Domestic Cats. And this is referenced at the end of your handouts, and also a link to the PDF of this study is also included in the resource widget if you have an interest. And then lastly is the need for additional studies for cats. There's been so little that's been done so far, and this really is necessary for accuracy and reliability. So one thing I would ask of you people that are involved with shelters is that if you're asked to respond to a survey regarding feline behavior assessments, respond to them, because that information can be very helpful to the individuals doing the study and may be something that can be used in the future. Okay, so what are some of the feline behavior assessment tools that are out there? In an informal survey that I've conducted over the last couple of months across shelters across the U.S. on feline behavior assessments, what I found as being used in this order are nationally available programs, real commonly something called felinality, which we'll talk about in more detail later. Many have no formal program in place. They rely on observations and experience. And then the third would be that the shelters design a program in-house, something specifically they use just for their shelter. And sometimes they may share that with others. Okay, I think we have our next poll question.
Excellent. So here's a question for you. How does your shelter perform formal feline behavior assessments? Using a nationally available program, using a shelter-designed in-house program, using a program designed by another shelter, no formal program is used, rely on observations and experience, we do not do any behavior assessments for cats. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and push the results. So 8% said using a nationally available program, 8.5, I think that probably says 9% on your screen, using a shelter-designed in-house program, 1% using a program designed by another shelter, and 72% said no formal program is used and they rely on observations and experience, and then 11% said we do not do any behavior assessments for cats.
Another surprised by these numbers. I suspect that shelters that aren't using any kind of formal program, one of the reasons they wanted to watch this webcast is to learn more about what's available. So I'm not surprised with those numbers at all. Okay, so let's go on here. Let's talk about some of those nationally available programs. And again, if you go to the resource widget, links to either links or actual documents have been provided where you could learn more about them. And they come from the American Humane Society, the ASPCA, the Meet Your Match Felinality, which we'll talk about more detail, something from the British Columbia SPCA Cat Sense. We've got some information from Cornell University, and also the core behavior assessments from Pet Behavior Solutions. But let's spend just a little bit of time talking about felinality, which is probably, in my assessment, my interviews with shelters, is probably the most common tool that's being used, throughout the country. And it's part of the ASPCA's Meet Your Match program. It is research-based, which I think is great. Now, the research was done in 3 phases. Phase 1 focused on determining if an accurate prediction could be made about how a cat would like to behave in a home environment. Phase 2 assessed the efficiency of the tool in a shelter environment. That is, cats' behavior both in the cage and during assessment were compared to new adopter reports. And then Phase 3 was matching cats with adopters. So they were assigned one of the 9 felinalities were assigned to each one of the cats based on the assessment score. So this assessment of the cat's behavior is matched with the adopter lifestyle and preferences. Shelters that tested felinality, the felinality program, found that 40 to 45% increase in adoptions and a 45 to 50% decrease in returns in euthanasia, which are pretty impressive numbers. Now, what they did is they were very creative. They applied some color codes to adopters. And so in a nutshell, what they did is that purple adopters were perfect for kitties who needed time and encouragement to adjust to a new surrounding. So the cats were identified with names like secret, or one of the felinalities were either secret admirer, love bug, or private investigator. Now, the orange adopters are a good fit for the companion kitty. So they got names like sidekick, executive, personal assistant. And then lastly, the green adopters were more successful with cats who quickly adapt to new situations. So they had names like party animal, MVP, and leader of the band. So I thought they did a real creative, did a real good job, not only from a research standpoint, but also in their creativity in presenting it. Another tool that's available nationwide, actually this is from British Columbia, SPCA in Canada, and what this program is also research-based, and this program provides daily welfare assessment done by the staff, as well as behavior assessments for matching animals with adopters. It's really a system for shelter workers to help them understand the emotions experienced by cats in their care. It comes with a manual that guides putting in place a system for ensuring good welfare of the cats in the shelter environment. And there's sections on housing, cat behavior, ways to improve welfare, checklists for monitoring cat stress, and templates for both short and long-term planning to be put in place for good welfare practices. It comes with a training DVD that explains the emotional states experienced by cats in shelters and provides video examples of cats displaying anxiety, fear, frustration, and depression, things that we really want to be aware of in a shelter setting. And there's a really good video that talks about the hide, perch, and go box, which is a tool they use to reduce stress and improve the welfare of cats. All right, so what are some of the in-house programs that are out there? And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but the information about these different assessments are available in the resources widget. Now, I'll give you an example. The Animal Humane Society. A couple of weeks ago, I was having a delightful conversation with Kathy Johnson, who's the Director of Animal Services, about their Bound for Home program. And they developed a point-based system on behavior, using it was based on behavior, age, health, and special characteristics. And for their behavior part of it, they put together what they call a FIFA, which stands for Feline Evaluation for Adoption. And they were able to increase, by using this point-based system of looking at those 4 different characteristics, they were able to increase their placement rate and decrease their euthanasia rate. Now, in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, they created something with, I think, a great name, a catitude assessment. And it was designed by several employees that got their heads together and came up with a form that they use. And they also use a point system to assign creative personality names. They have things like Cool Cat, Mixed Bag, Royalty Cat, TLC Cat, and also one for identifying cats that need behavior modification. They believe it's a helpful tool because it does give them some insight about the cat. For example, they know that cool cats usually integrate into new situations pretty easily. They also get a feel for cats and how they will interact with kids, and it helps for matching that they do with potential adopters. And then the one that we designed for the Dane County Friends of Ferals is really a modified version of felinality, but we take into consideration the population of cats that are in our care, which is either the feral or the friendly, and so we've modified it to accommodate for that. All right, so let's talk specifically, how do you perform a feline behavior assessment? What's the who, the when, the where, how is it done, how is it used? We'll start out with the who. Ideally, it should be done for all cats. But again, like I stated at the beginning, I realize that it is something that maybe all shelters don't have the resources to be able to do this. So my suggestion would be, at a minimum, I would use a behavior assessment for special needs cats, whether that be cats with medical issues or behavioral issues, so that you can identify what type of needs that they have. And then the second would be cats that are going into foster care, because again, they're going to be interacting directly in a home environment, and you want to make sure that the foster care parent is safe. So the when. Okay, we have to remember that stress influences behavior. This may result in an increase or decreased aggression and or fear. So it's not clear as to when it should specifically be done. There's a need for more research in this area. What many people that do behavior assessments, they do it at or after 3 days that they've been at the shelter. And we know that timings doing the least amount of time is important so that we can get these cats to adoption as quickly as possible. And there has been some research done by the ASPCA that indicates the cat's behavior changes over the first 72 hours after arrival to the shelter alters the ability to accurately predict socialization. So that's another reason to do it at or after 3 days of age, or 3 days of age, 3 days after being at the shelter. And where do we want to do it? Well, it really starts at the cage side. But we have to be aware that the behavior that is exhibited by the cat at the cage may not be a true reflection of his or her behavior. Again, some of the research that was done by felinality showed that the behavior in the cage did not correlate with the adopter report as strongly as many of the out-of-the-cage items. So it will involve removing the cat from the cage, if possible, and do it safely, using a carrier and transfer to a larger, calmer, quieter living space. And this can be helpful with behavior. As a matter of fact, when I was listening to a presentation at a veterinary conference by Dr. Sheila Diarpino from the Animal Rescue League of Boston, she reported that by moving the cat to a larger, calmer, quieter living space, improved behavior in 90% of their cats. So that's a pretty impressive number. So where do we want to do this? Ideally, it's going to be done in an area that's free of noise, and that's probably number one because that's the biggest stressor for cats. Devoid of traffic and with other distractions. You want to separate them from other animals, especially barking dogs. And then you want to do it in an area where there aren't any hiding places, with the exception of the carrier that you use. And preferably in a smaller room that's approximately 10 feet by 10 feet. Now, if that's not available, you could potentially use like an exercise pen that's in a larger room. And then how is it done? there's going to be 4 different things that I'm going to talk about in more detail, and the initial behavior assessment being part of that, and staff and volunteer observations and behavior rounds or mini assessments. Those are probably the three critical ones. So let's talk about the initial behavior assessment. Now, if the cat is surrendered, we really need to start with a review of the relinquishment or surrender form. And several intake forms, including surrender profiles, are included in the resources widget. Now, if possible, you want to use a point system to reduce bias. And before I talk about this more detail, I want to talk a little bit about stress and anxiety and how this, we have to consider this because it influences behavior. Like we mentioned before, it can increase or decrease fear and or aggression. Some of the common causes are noise, and that's something that should really be considered, especially when you're doing assessments. It can be things like a change in the schedule or proximity to other animals. So consider all those things. And some of the signs of stress and anxiety, and other things can cause this too, but these are common signs of stress and anxiety. A big one is hiding and crouching, being hyper alert, freezing. So be aware of all these potential signs that may mean the cat is stressed. So back to performing the evaluation. It starts at the cat's cage. And what I'm going to do is next is I'm showing you a video that follows. The video that follows is an example of a cage site assessment, which is usually the first step in any feline behavior assessment. Due to time limitations, we're unable to show a complete behavior assessment, but I'm hoping that this will be a helpful demonstration. Now, the video we'll be using is from the Dane County Friends of Ferals. It's a cage site assessment, and it's critical for our organization because the type of cats we usually take in, and those that don't welcome human attention. Okay, we'll get started here. Now, the first is a greeting approach. And what we're doing here is it involves approaching the front of the cage while speaking softly to the cat in a normal tone of voice and observing the cat's response. Gallagher here isn't real happy. As you can tell, he's hissed a couple times at us. Now, the next step is using a remote object for interaction. Now, this involves placing a small diameter pole, approximately 1/4 inch or less, with a blunt end slowly into the slowly into the cage. And then what we're going to do here shortly, so we're placing it just slowly in there, monitoring what the cat's response is. And you want to do this using a gloved hand, just in case. And you can see she's showing this is Shadow here, she's showing some interest, so that's a good sign, showing some interaction. And then you want to gradually, if possible, stroke the cat with the end of the pole, all the while observing the cat's response. And what this says to me is Shadow is showing some interaction. She's interested, and she's interested in interacting with that pole and potentially, hopefully, with people. The next one in here is with Sassy, and we're doing a food interaction. This step involves offering some food, usually canned food or baby food, on a spoon using a gloved hand again, starting at the cage door and then gradually moving the spoon towards the cat, again observing the cat's response. As you can see here, Sassy didn't take any time lapping up that baby food that I gave him. And this is a really good sign because when cats are stressed, they will not eat. And this is a very good sign that he's really adapting to the shelter environment, and I think would do very well in a home setting. Of course, there's many more things that we need to do in the assessment, but this is a good sign. And then the next step is what we call touch interaction. And this involves opening the cage door slightly and then slowly presenting a gloved hand. So you start the cage door and then gradually move the gloved hand towards the cat. And if possible, gently stroking the cat with the gloved hand. Well, Sassy here actually started purring at the end of it. Okay. Now we'll go to our next one. Now, the next step usually in performing an evaluation, and every shelter is going to be different. I just kind of showed you what we use at the Dane County Friends of Ferals just because of the population of cats that we get in. But when we get to the introducing them to a novel room, this is kind of the beginning assessment of interactive behaviors in more detail. And interactive behaviors can include things like meows, chirps, looks, blinks, rubbing up against you, touching you, and being on your lap. So you want to allow the cat to explore the room for about 5 minutes or so, noting their behavior. And some recommend even going ahead and timing how long it takes for the cat to exit the carrier. Now, once you've done the introduction to the novel room, it's recommended, and this comes from Felinality, and I'm in agreement with the recommendations, that we go ahead and we assess some different interactions with the cat. So the first would be calling, where you crouch down on the opposite side of the room from the cat, and about maybe 5 to 6 feet away from the cat, call the cat to you several times. Extend a hand with a closed fist, towards him or her. And the next step would be, with using a closed or open hand. While still crouching, you extend the open hand to the cat. Your hand should be lower than the cat's head, so they don't view it as a threat. And if the cat does not approach you, approach when you call him, then walk towards the cat and then crouch next to him and see how he responds. The next step is stroking. While talking to the cat, use your open hand slightly cupped to stroke the cat in long strokes along the head, back and sides, and you continue this for 4 or 5 long, slow strokes if possible. The next is play. Beginning a couple of feet away from the cat, you slowly move a piece of string or yarn along the floor to initiate play. Observe the cat's reaction, and then try to engage the cat in play with at least 3 different toys. It could be something like a ball or a toy mouse, a cat charmer, a feather wand. Now, it is recommended not to use catnip toys during the behavior assessment because of the impact that can have on their behavior. The next would be hugging. So we would call the cat again until he or she approaches you, or approach the cat yourself, and then begin to stroke the cat until she's calm, and gently picking her up and cradling her to your chest, with the cat's body sideways toward your chest for a full 2 seconds, if possible. And then the last is sensitivity, and this might involve holding the paw or grasping the tail. And it could be something like sitting on the ground and allowing the cat to approach you if she chooses to do so. Wait at least 60 seconds before you stroke the cat, and then you just gently grasp the cat's tail firmly at the base of the tail, and that's important, at the base. And then you gently pick the cat up with a steady pressure, just enough to almost, but not quite, move the cat's back feet off the floor, and you hold for 1 second. Again, keeping track of the cat's response to this. Now what we want to do is we want to talk about the input from staff and volunteer observations. This really includes the day-to-day observations experienced by the staff and volunteers. It is helpful if these people can be trained about feline body language and behavioral observation. And it's something that they should keep a note in the behavior record, which typically is with the medical record too. They should be all in one, but some choose to keep it separate. But I like it to keep them in the same record, so that we don't have more than one record that we have to chase down. And then this kind of leads into behavior rounds, where the behavior record is going to be very helpful. This is done after the initial assessment, and ideally 3 times a week. Again, understanding that not all shelters have that kind of resource. But it's a mini assessment where we walk through the shelter to briefly assess each cat, and we take a look at their behavior records. To see what the volunteers or staff are saying about the cat. Is there a need for medical intervention, behavior intervention? Is foster care needed? And a review of that behavior record. It is used as an adjunct to the daily medical rounds, which most shelters do. And then lastly, the use of behavior experts. And this is something you can use as needed. They can be helpful to manage individual animals, provide continued education, and if you do not have someone that you currently use, I belong to an organization called the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior, or AVSAB. And on their website, you can actually go ahead and do a search for people that are in your area, or these are veterinarians that are, concentrate their efforts on behavior and have a special interest in that. Okay, so categorization. As we discussed previously, behavior assessments are used as an ancillary tool, which is added to information gathered from other resources. So things like the owner relinquishment questionnaires, staff and volunteer experiences. Behavior assessments combined with these other resources allow us to categorize the cats to address their needs for decision making about the shelter population and matching the cat with the adopter. This helps us reach our ultimate goal of matching the cat with the best possible home. All right, so in conclusion, I hope you all agree that behavior assessments can be very helpful with achieving our ultimate goal, which is matching the pet with the very best possible home. And really, that's what it's all about. And in order to have a successful behavior assessment program, they really start with the organizational leadership. And what the leadership does is establish a vision. Allocate the appropriate resources. Maybe that involves assembling a team of volunteers that want to be involved with this. That's what we've done at the Dane County Friends of Ferals. We have a wonderful group of volunteers that are very dedicated and very interested in this area. And then also develop support throughout the group. And then I end with, we have to start somewhere. Although there's much of what we use for feline behavior assessments has yet to be scientifically validated. We have to start somewhere. Hopefully we'll be able to learn from our experiences, which will allow us to improve our methods, helping us reach our ultimate goal. Now what I would do is I would encourage all of you to stay current on this topic. And one place that you'll be able to do this is on the Maddie's Institute website. Okay, Dr. Peek, I think we're ready for questions.
Great. Well, we have some time for a few questions. Let me just grab a couple. Here's a good question. I'm going to push it to the slide area.
Okay.
So what's the best advice for dealing with unpredictable, to us, aggression or determining a cat's triggers, and thresholds for overstimulation?
Great question, and it's a tough one to answer. But the first thing I would recommend is make sure the people that are doing assessments and things like that, that they're safe, because their safety is paramount. And so if it's a situation that you have someone that's doing an assessment and there is a lot of unpredictability, then maybe either let the cat stay, cool down over a period of a couple of days, or have someone that's very experienced, do the assessment. But as far as for dealing with unpredictable behavior, you have to be prepared for it. So what we might use at the Dane County Friends of Ferals, where we do have quite a bit of this, is that we always have the people involved in any handling of the cats. They're wearing heavily gloved hands, using a towel to give them to provide them with the visual security, and then just calmly remove the top of the towel to see how they react. Now, what is important is identifying triggers. That's going to be something that you're going to do as the cat's there, making a note on the behavior record so that other people are aware of it. And sometimes there is this threshold of overstimulation. So the important thing to do is to make a record of that in the behavior, or make a note of that in the behavior record so that other people are aware of it. But it's a tough one to do, and something that there is no set test that we can do to help with that unpredictability.
Okay, here's another question for you, Dr. Krebsbach. As a foster-based organization, is there a way to do the assessment in the home of the potential cat we would be taking into our program?
Sure, I think that there's a possibility. Ideally, it's best to have the same location, because what we talked about is that standardization and adding to the reliability and all that. But sometimes you don't have that luxury. So I don't know, one thing you can consider doing is maybe there is someone that's kind of the head of your behavior team. Maybe they have a place in their home that you always do the assessments. That would be ideal. Now, if that isn't an option and you actually have to do the assessment at the foster parent's home, then I would recommend that you do it in an area. Try to replicate what we talked about earlier. Do it in a smaller room where there aren't hiding places, and then following the same thing, trying to follow the same procedures you would even if you were using the same location over and over again.
Okay, here's another question. Do you monitor your shelter cat's behavior while it's at your shelter from when it arrives until it is adopted?
Yes, we do, and I would recommend that. And that's where where I talked about the notes from both the care staff as well as the volunteers should be kept with the cat's record, which includes the medical and the behavior. And I think it's really helpful to have that information.
Okay. Here's another question. Do you send any cats back to their original feral colony or outdoor caregivers if not considered adoptable through your shelter program? Do you transfer to behaviorally astute foster homes?
Okay. To answer the first question is that usually with the Dane County Friends of Ferals anyways, we receive the cats in the first place because they can't be returned to their original site. For example, there was a colony of 9 cats that were at the local airport, and they were in a building that was being torn down. And so we took them in because they couldn't be returned. So whenever possible, we always try to return cats to their original colony. So we do these we call monthly spay-neuter-thons. And so we do trap and return for caregivers that bring the cats in, that either feral or free-roaming cats, and they're returned to their original site. But once they're in our program, they're usually there because they cannot be returned to their original, site. So then they're that trap, neuter, relocate if they're considered feral. So we identify outdoor homes with a responsible caregiver. And then the next question is, do we transfer to behaviorally astute foster homes? And what we will do is for example, if we feel a cat is more fearful than feral, then what we might do is we would identify a good foster home that has a lot of experience dealing with a fearful cat and helping them overcome some of their fears through a behavior modification program. So that is a possibility as well, yes. But those would be for the fearful ones, not for the feral ones. Those we want to get to a rural home as quickly as possible.
Okay. To follow that question, here's a good question. Would you be able to give an example of a behavior modification plan for a fearful cat?
Okay, absolutely, because this is a real common thing that we see. So one of the things that with fearful cats is that they are they're not used to interaction. So you saw on the video where we were doing slow interactions. Now remember, the cage interaction isn't necessarily what they're going to be in an outdoor or outside of the cage. So we try to do that. We try to use food. Maybe we try to give them food with encouragement by just putting a little bit on their nose or something like that. Now, for those volunteers that are comfortable doing this, and what we might do is what I call forced interaction. And I would not recommend this with dogs, but it is something that we will often use with cats. And with cats that are fearful, is that we will use, again, gloved hands with a towel, wrap the cat around, or the towel around the cat, and then just literally just hold them for a period of time. And the reason we even came up with this, Friends of Ferals, we started probably, I think it was 11 years ago, and what we realized is that the cat, for a cat to go from feral to friendly, you just wanted them to get sick because then they were forced to be given, medication. And what we've realized is a lot of these cats that we're giving medication to actually became more friendly. I wouldn't say a majority of them, but many of them did. So this idea of forced interaction was something that we use. So that might be the thing that we use is start out with this forced interaction, and then maybe you start it for a short period of time, and then you gradually expand that time. Now, is there going to be some stress that the cat goes through? Yes, but eventually we hope they become desensitized to human touch, and in many cases that happens. As a matter of fact, I had an example from a couple of years ago. We had a hoarding situation where we took in many cats. They'd all been declawed. And so we didn't feel comfortable, and many of them were not used to being interacted with at all. And so we were not comfortable, putting them in an outdoor setting with a responsible caregiver. So we had a behavior team put together where we essentially did a behavior modification plan for many of these cats. And I would say the majority of them, through very intensive behavior modification program, which involved a lot of this forced interaction, actually were able to be adopted to an indoor home.
Oh, that's great. Okay, I'm going to send you a few more questions we have time for.
Okay.
When so many cats lose their homes due to litter box issues, what can be done in the shelter setting to mitigate those problems or stop them from developing in the first place?
Okay. I think that's a two-pronged answer. The first thing is, as someone that's been dealing with behavior for over 10 decades, over 10 decades, I'm not that old yet, over a decade, the most common behavior problem I see is litter box issues. And in most cases, almost all of them can be resolved through education, and usually that will be doing environmental changes, in the household, as long as the caregivers follow through on it. So one thing that a shelter could do is provide a resource to people who want to surrender their cat because of litter box issues. Now, I understand. Sometimes you're going to have people that call you up and they've already made up their mind and they're going to surrender the cat no matter what you do. But the best thing for the cat is if you could prevent them ever from coming through and providing them with resources to help them resolve the issue while the cat's in their home is the number one thing. Now, as far as once they're in the shelter, what we find, as a matter of fact, I gave a presentation out about this at Purdue back in October, is that once the cat is actually in the shelter, many times we don't see the behavior issues. Because remember, we've changed their environment. So it's important to try, so then the next step would be, okay, well, putting the cat in a foster home, starting out in a small setting, maybe a bathroom, and then gradually exposing them to more and more areas of the house to see if the same issue takes place, as long as they're doing all the recommendations like scooping the litter box at least daily, having at least one more litter box and never cats in the household, all those standard recommendations. So that would be the two things I would recommend. Number one, trying to do the best you can to educate the person who potentially wants to surrender the cat with things that they can do to prevent the cat from ever coming into the shelter. And then once they are in the shelter, probably the best thing to do is to set them up in a foster home situation so you can replicate the same environment that they had before they were surrendered.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to do two more questions. Our shelter is very small and built in 1962. Getting away from the dog noise is impossible. What recommendations do you have for shelters like ours to carry out assessments?
That's a tough one. I guess the best thing you do is if there's maybe somebody's office that you could use that is some distance away from the dog noise. I realize there's always going to be some, but if there could just be some area that where you could do the assessments, I'd really encourage you to do that. And sometimes maybe it's even the bathroom. I don't know, depending on how big your shelter is. But trying to identify some area that is not next to the dogs, at least as far away as possible, would be, I think, really helpful with getting better information on your assessments.
Okay, and this is going to be the last question.
Okay.
There are other questions, but I'm sure Dr. Krebsbach would be happy to answer them for us, and we'll post them on our website for everybody. So if we didn't get to your question, please just check our website, and we'll post the questions there for you. Probably give her some time to answer them. But
okay, I'd be happy to do so.
Maybe. So here's the last question for tonight. How do you assess which cats are better to stay in a cage as opposed to a communal adoption room? And how much time does that take?
Okay. Well, it's a tough one because what we don't want to have in a communal room is obviously aggression towards each other. So it's important to have at least 3 days that they've been in the shelter before you do any kind of assessment. Now, You might want to do things like, you could take the cat and put them, they're in a cage next to another, other cat. How do they respond to that? Some will where you could put them both in a carrier and have them visualize each other from a distance, and and then gradually bring the carriers closer together to see how they react to that. Another step would be is once you put them in the communal room, if they're a new addition to the communal room, you have to spend some time watching the interaction, because realize that one cat's interaction with another cat may be different from another cat, and so there may be some confrontations there. But I guess my recommendation would be to do the visual introductions, with both in a carrier, and potentially use several different cats to see how that cat responds. And the second would be to, once you introduce them to the communal room, is to spend some time really observing them before you allow them to have free access to it. And as far as how much time that takes, I can't give you a specific. It depends on the cat. Some have a very easy transition. Others take a lot more time.
Okay, well, that's the end of our event, and we want to thank Dr. Krebsbach and all of you for your time tonight, for listening to this important subject. We hope you'll join us on July 12th for How Animal Shelters Are Beating Ringworm, and yours can too, with Dr. Karen Moriello of the University of Wisconsin College of Veterinary Medicine. We'll be emailing you information on how to register for the webcast, and we hope to see you there. Next, please click on the link to take our survey. It might have been blocked by your pop-off blocker, or it might be on a different screen. And if it is, we'll be emailing you the link, and we'd appreciate it if you could take a few moments to respond to it. We also invite you to come to www.maddiesinstitute.org and sign up for our mailing list. And follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/MaddiesInstitute, and on Twitter at MaddiesInst. That's MADDIESINST. We hope you checked out the resources and the widgets at the bottom of your screen, but if not, we'll be emailing the links to you, as well as contacting the winners of Dr. Dodman's personally signed book and sharing a link to the archived version of tonight's webcast. Thanks again for being here with us this evening.